The Russian cries in pain as he strikes you. Nobody should be surprised. The people that created the state of Israel, well, where did a lot of them come from? Soviet Russia, Nazi Germany. Those two axes of evil, right, that signed a pact to divvy up Europe between them. Yeah. Since then, Germany, at least for the time being, had joined the quote unquote good side, the lesser evil. And, well, Russia's still just Russia. The biggest empire in the history of the world, the history that can, be confirmed. We could all see, right? We have living ancestors, or maybe they died recently, who can confirm this. The biggest empire in the history of the modern world. Yeah? Sending their agents to bitch and moan and complain about imperialism. And the right wing wokes, the woke right, they just run with it. Like, you guys are so brainwashed. By the way, I wasn't aware that those woke right, or as I would call them, right wing wokes, it's a thing now. It's like a mainstream thing now. I had no idea. Where did that come from? I can't be the only person who considered thought of this because it's kind of obvious, right? There's so much whining and complaining on the right also, and ultimately they're leftists anyway, so they have that in common. And so much as aggressive as they are, right? They like to present themselves as victims, right? That's the right wing wokes. That's Israel. That's Russia. It's a sign of weakness, really. It is. Have you ever heard the United States or NATO complaining about Russian missile defense sites, bases? Do they ever cry and complain about the fact that Russia want to defend themselves from any potential missile attacks from anywhere? Now, why does Russia always, incessantly, like a little bitch that it is, whine and cry about the fact that other people might want to defend themselves from them? Russia says new U.S. base in Poland raises overall nuclear danger, right? So a defensive base. Now, don't get me wrong. Any of these bases could be used to attack Russia too. Sure. But so what? That's not why they're there. And anyway, Russia said on Thursday that a new U.S. ballistic missile defense base in northern Poland will lead to an increase in the overall danger level of nuclear danger. Make that make sense, right? But Warsaw said threats from Moscow only strengthened the argument for NATO defenses. So Putin's been threatening to nuke the whole world, everybody, anybody that doesn't give his little bitch ass what he wants, right? He's literally saying that they're gonna nuke NATO. Or some of his people, propagandists, are saying they're gonna nuke London, right? And then when Europe wants to build or implement missile defense sites, they bitch and moan and cry. I mean, this is incredible. It's incredible that the right wing wokes buy this shit. That's how fucking stupid they are. This is another frankly provocative step in a series of deeply destabilizing actions by the Americans and their allies in the North Atlantic Alliance in the strategic sphere. Right? It's a provocative step. You want to neuter our ability to attack you. What? This is the reason why Russia whines about this is because They're the aggressor. They always have been the aggressor. Okay? You don't get to become the biggest empire in modern history and not be the aggressor. Duh. I mean, this should be so obvious to people. But I mean, right wing wokes, they're wokes for a reason. Um, you know, the reason why it's Russia hates this is because it lessens the effectiveness of their threats, right? That's why they don't like these defensive missile shields. That's why they have a problem with NATO, a defensive alliance. That's what it is for the most part. And yes, obviously, as Sun Tzu pointed out, and everybody agrees, sometimes, especially all the Russophiles, right? Sometimes offense is the best form of defense. Yeah, but it's generally a defensive alliance. The reason why NATO came into existence, let me remind everybody, is because of the threat that USSR posed, right? After it had invaded Europe and genocided Polish intelligentsia, right? Along with Germany. That's what they did. And Putin is carrying on that legacy. Of course he is. Wasn't his daddy Stalin's chef, right? This idea that this guy just like came out of nowhere, right? Pulled himself up by his bootstraps. Don't be stupid. He was connected from. He was always connected. So the Russian cries in pain as he strikes you. Seems to be a commie thing. You know what I mean? Marxist. I don't know exactly, but well, where did Israel and why do Israel and Russia have this thing in common? So yeah, NATO was created because of the Soviet-Russian threat. When the Russian army was, well, first of all, they invaded Poland, just as Germans did, came in from the West. But when Germans were, and I'm not saying they were good or anything like that, but when they were going through Poland, yeah, and I got this from firsthand. I got firsthand testimony from people who were there. They're now dead, but they told me that everybody were praying that they would be taken over by the Germans and not the Russians. Because of, and I'm not saying the Germans were kind, far from it, but they preferred to be under German rule than the Russian rule because of how horrible the Soviets were. Even as they were liberating, quote unquote, liberating Central Europe and going into Germany, right? They were murdering, raping, stealing, doing the things that they do to this day. Even as they were, quote unquote, liberating the people there. It's what they did. It's what they do. This is who they are. Sorry. But, people just don't, you don't know anything about history. You just repeat Russian propaganda. That's all you're good for, right-wing wokes. So, and, NATO membership is voluntary. This language is all fucked up. You're calling it NATO expansion, NATO expansion. Well, technically, sure, that's not incorrect, but it's not a very precise way of describing what's happening. NATO isn't really expanding into all these different countries. All these different sovereign, independent countries want to join NATO because they know Russia. They know what it's like to be under Russia. They know the repression, the murder. They know all the crimes that Russians commit the genocides that they've committed over the years. They are very, very familiar. They still remember what the Russian Empire does to people, how it treats its subjects. That's why it's that's pushing them to join NATO in many instances. And NATO isn't just going to take anybody anyway. Like, Russia will take anybody by force, anyone they can by force. NATO will welcome some people, but you have to meet certain conditions. You can't just join NATO like that. And it's voluntary. Russia forces people under the rule. That's why those people want to join NATO, to protect themselves from Russia. NATO isn't the aggressor, you fucking idiots who believe this dumb shit. It's Russia. NATO isn't some kind of monolithic empire. It's a defensive alliance. Russia is clearly the aggressor. Whenever does NATO complain about Russia wanting to defend itself? But when missile shield defensive sites sprout up all across Europe, Russia cries in pain as they strike you. You gotta be a special kind of fucking idiot not to understand these basic facts about the reality of things in Europe. Special kind of an idiot. So we had this Oreshnik missile, mid-range, not intercontinental, whatever the fuck, ballistic missile, right? Which violates, well, now defunct, INF Treaty. The Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces INF Treaty, signed in 1987, prohibits the United States and Russia from possessing ground-launched ballistic and cruise missiles with ranges between 500 and 5,500 kilometers in order to diminish the risk of nuclear war, right? This is Oreshnik falls in that category. In the early years of this historic treaty, both sides collectively destroyed more than 2,600 missiles, eliminating an entire class of weapons. Unfortunately, that was then, and this is now. Russia is cheating on the INF Treaty. Russia started its covert program to violate the INF Treaty probably in the mid-2000s, and now has fielded multiple battalions of an illegal missile that fires to range prohibited by the INF Treaty. Substantial evidence leading to this conclusion was accumulated over time. Rather than rush to judgment, the United States pursued diplomacy for more than 5 years. Right? That's how aggressive they are. Starting in 2013 to return Russia to full and verifiable compliance. Diplomacy, right? The goal of the United States was and remains to preserve the INF Treaty. However, Russia never chose to engage in a sincere or substantive matter. Russia instead chose to lie about the existence of the illegal missile. So first they said it didn't exist, well, while continuing to produce, test, and eventually field the missile. There's only so long that you could hide such a missile, right? Because of satellites, intelligence, snitches, right? Spies. Russia stuck with its original lie until 2017 when the United States revealed the Russian name, 9M729. How did they know that? Right? Intelligence. Because people will come and say, oh, it's all lies. They're making. Okay, evidence. You need evidence, right? Because evidence for all of this exists. They even named the missile before the Russians admitted that this class, this type of missile exists. Russia then pivoted to a new lie, right? Once they were, the jig was up, they said, oh, the missile does exist. We said it didn't, but no, it does really exist, but it still complies with the treaty because of some technicality. That's not all that important, right? Something about where you're launching it from and blah, 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 blah. Or maybe how it's deployed, right? The United States has worked aggressively to bring Russia back into compliance. We tried an integrated strategy of diplomatic, economic, and military measures, right? Sanctions, missile shield defenses. We try to dissuade Russia from going down this path and offer them opportunities to change course. When these measures failed to change Russia's behavior, President Trump announced on October 20, 2018 that the United States would terminate the INF Treaty. Then on December 4th, Secretary Pompeo announced that the NATO Foreign Ministerial in Brussels, at the Foreign Ministerial in Brussels, that Russia is in material breach of the treaty, and as remedy, the United States would suspend its obligation. So United States said, all right, we're out. We're going to, this is implied, right? We're going to develop these missiles ourselves, or take this old missile technology that we have, and bring it back, develop, improve it. Russia has responded to this final opportunity to fix the problem it created with hollow calls for dialogue, half measures, and threatening rhetoric. Sounds like Russia. Russia's violation of the INF Treaty is not its only arms control violation. Russia is also in violation of an obligation under the Chemical Weapons Convention, and Conventional Armed Forces in Europe Treaty, and Open Skies Treaty. There's been rumors of Russia using banned chemical weapons in Europe. What's the other one? Not carpet bombing, but something, I forget what it's called. Using all kinds of illegal weapons, right? So NATO, Ukraine responded, right, by using these internationally banned weapons. So you're already seeing comments that this is what NATO gets for withdrawing or canceling this INF treaty, right? This is what you get. Well, no, that's not how this works. That's not how evidence works, right? They withdrew from the treaty because Russia was developing this missile, the same missile they just used recently, right? So Russia responded once the United States withdrew from the treaty, meaning you have to assume they started working uh, on in this technology, right? Russian President Vladimir Putin suggested adding mutual verification measures to this proposal for a moratorium on deployment of missiles formerly banned by the 1987 INF Treaty. These measures, he said on October 26, would focus on Asia's aerial ballistic missile defense system deployed at NATO bases in Europe and Russian military facilities in Kaliningrad. Putin claimed that the latter measure would confirm the absence of the 9M729, a ground-launched cruise missile that the United States says violated the INF Treaty, and cited as a reason for U.S. withdrawal, right? Putin also reiterated that Russia believes this missile was compliant with the treaty, right? The same missile they said, it doesn't exist. Oh, well, it really does exist, but it's okay. We can have it, right? And Russia will continue not to deploy this missile in European Russia, right? Oh, so past the Urals, you will deploy it? Oh, okay. As long as NATO members do not field similar missiles in Europe, right? So now Russia is afraid. The jig is up, right? The element of surprise is no longer there. Now the West is going to develop these same missiles and countermeasures, more importantly, right? And now it's a problem for Putin, obviously, because he's the aggressor. The United States believes that Russia has deployed 4 battalions of the 9M729 for a total of about 100 missiles in areas of the country able to strike NATO countries. Washington is moving quickly to develop and deploy this type of missile, according to Trump administration officials. So once the West realized Putin was deploying this missile, and called him out on it, then he was like, oh, well. And look at what he's complaining about, right? The defense systems, ballistic missile defense systems, right? Why does he care about defense? Why? Because he's the aggressor, obviously. I mean, this isn't rocket science. Well, it is, and it isn't. Putin denied an ICBM strike, confirmed use of the 9M729 Oreshnik. So then, seems to me, correct me if I'm wrong, 9M729 is a class of missiles, a certain type of platform that has various types of missiles. It encompasses various different types of missiles. So when the United States was saying Russia was developing this class of missiles, they were talking about something other than the Oreshnik, or they didn't have intel good enough to be able to say exactly what they were developing, right? So Russia recently used this first time ever, used this missile, right? Now I'm not saying this is absolute proof, right? But if this were to go to court, Russia would lose. Meaning, if we were arguing who violated the treaty or why the treaty was canceled, right? This proves that because it takes a long time to develop these missiles and then test and use them, right? And United States having better technology overall and more importantly more money, you'd have to it's fair to assume that once they put their mind behind something and start funding a project, they could probably bring it and make it operational quicker, or at the very least as quick as the Russians, but probably quicker, right? So having seen Russia develop this technology or instill or redevelop, I guess you would say, this technology and use it first, right? It's fair to assume they started working on it or working on this old technology that existed already before the US did, right? They already used this missile. They have it. United States said, hey, you're working on this. This is why we have to pull out of the treaty because you're not complying with it. And Russia's story keeps changing. And then the missile appears, not only to US intelligence, they call it out. They even called out the name. How did they know what the name was? What the, right? Spies, intelligence, they called it out. So the jig is up. Like, this isn't saying that US, it's not absolute proof that it was actually US or NATO that started developing this technology and Russia responded. That's possible, right? But I mean, if Russia had evidence that US was funding this technology, this banned technology under the treaty, well, you don't think their propaganda would have brought this up and justified their own use of this? No, they got called out on it, and now they used it. Like, this is basically proof that the United States was correct, that Russia is the aggressor. And they were started working on it according to U.S. intel mid 2000s, right? So right around Euromaidan, after they had invaded all these other countries, right? They've been getting ready to invade Eastern Europe and maybe go further for quite some time, and been developing the exact type of range, missile with the type of range that would be best for this, right? Fighting your neighbors. If this were to go to court, Russia loses, right? Yeah, they violated the treaty, would be the verdict, and this is proof positive. United States was correct. Russia is the aggressor. This is just more evidence of this, and this is what gets me, right? There's so much talk of Western propaganda, and yeah, obviously it exists. There's definitely a lot of fake news. There's a lot of bullshit. Like, for example, there isn't, there doesn't seem to be conclusive proof that there's North Koreans already fighting in Kursk, right? I think this will come to pass. I think there's enough. Uh, I think what's happening is that they're being trained, but maybe haven't yet been deployed, or maybe not in enough numbers to really constitute as proof of 10,000 Koreans fighting on the side of Russia. But this will come to pass, I believe. And maybe this is just my opinion, right? US media is jumping ahead a little bit to respond to an incoming escalation, right? But it's it's not completely honest what they're doing, right? So there's definitely fake news, half truths. There's a lot of propaganda, and yeah, I'm not telling you that like BBC or ABC or Fox News they're telling you the truth. Duh, right? But there's this idea that among the right wing wokes that the U.S. is degenerate. It lies about everything. Their propaganda is so powerful, and Russia, the Christian Russia, right, always tells the truth, and that's fucking nonsense. That's absolute drivel. You gotta be a special kind of idiot to believe this nonsense, right? Russia is, insofar as the propaganda war goes, I mean, look, go survey Russians and see how many of them are pro US. And then go survey Americans and see how many of them are pro Russia. Absolute idiotic stance to take, but that's how strong Russian propaganda is. It has brainwashed so many Americans to suck Putin's dick and flirt with treason. Well, there's been some treasonous bastards exposed lately. That's for sure. The types of operations, you don't see these types of operations. I'm not saying they don't exist. Clearly there's spies, American, NATO, whatever, spies in Russia. Yeah, for sure. But you're not seeing the same type of propaganda push inside Russia, right? There's no American influence inside Russia. And maybe only because if you get caught in Russia, right? Well, you die in prison. In the United States, you have a court case, you have a right to a lawyer, things of that nature, right? But you don't see this type of propaganda push effort, the types of money in Russia, dollars, right, being paid to Russians to push Western agenda inside of Russia. It's just not happening. Definitely not to this degree, right? Russia is definitely winning the propaganda war. Definitely. That's obvious to see. They are the better propagandists. Okay? So to even think that it's the West that's so much better at this and Russia always tells the truth, well, that proves the point that Russia is winning the propaganda war. And here you have more evidence of this, right? US and Russia have been going back and forth about this 9M729 missile platform or class of missiles. And Russia's been denying it. US has been providing evidence, talking about the case is basically settled now, right? So why isn't the West, right, which is supposedly so great at propaganda and lying to its people and brainwashing everybody, why isn't the West using this to prove their point? Why isn't there, you're not really seeing, and I think it's a failure of U.S. intelligence, U.S. propaganda, NATO propaganda. It's a failure on their part because they're not that good at it, it would seem. Why aren't they using this arresting to prove that everything they've been saying throughout years is true? This basically proves that they were correct to pull out from the treaty. But you have all these bots running around and idiots brainwashed by Russian propaganda. This proves that the West wasn't lying, Russia was. This proves that it's the Russians that are the better propagandists, more likely to lie about everything. This proves it. But the West isn't using this to say, hey, see, we were correct in pulling out from the treaty, and this is why. You have bots running around saying, this is what you get, US, because you pulled out of the treaty, so Russia was forced to build this missile. You know what I mean? It's ass backwards. It's upside down. It doesn't make any sense. But that's really the point, right? Being pro-Russia is for special kind of idiots who just can't see the forest from the fucking trees. It's so obvious what's going on. But they've been so brainwashed and propagandized by Russia propaganda to a point where everything that Russia does, they project onto themselves and their own countries, to a point where they're flirting with treason, basically, and seem to be, at least on some level, receptive of being annihilated by Russia. You know what I mean? Because they don't want to move there. They don't want to go live there. But they're supporting a guy that says he wants to annihilate them. This is nihilism, right? It's sad. So, in conclusion, the West, yes, there's propaganda on both sides, but Russia, or the weak one, it's a sign of weakness. And because the United States still feels very powerful, and justifiably so, even though I think they probably overrate their own strength, that they don't have to resort to this type of slimy propaganda. Because this type of, and I'm not saying the West is moral, don't get me wrong, but this type of two-faced, slimy, immoral, Weasley behavior, right? This type of propaganda push from the Russian side is really a sign of weakness, right? They have to lie, cheat, steal, play the victim when they're the aggressor. They have to do this because they're not as strong militarily. They're not as powerful. They have to resort to propaganda and brainwashing and just in general other covert, underhanded means. And West, which is stronger, the West, and believes in their strength over Russia, that they are more powerful, doesn't, on some level, right, sees this type of engaging in this type of slimy propaganda, this such blatant lying, as a weakness, right? They're more brave, right? Now, I'm not saying that the West is virtuous, don't get me wrong, but telling the truth is more akin with being brave than lying. Lying is a sign of cowardice, right? So this is why I think US propaganda, it's just, second place. It's not that important, and it's the basis. Psychological warfare is the basis of Russian power versus the West. Their power is still more military might, which, it's easy to be brave when you're the more powerful one, and it's understandable why Russia would be so cowardly, because they're the weaker one, right? They have to resort to these immoral, underhanded, Weasley means of warfare, right? Hybrid warfare, psychological warfare, because they are not as powerful, not as strong. They have to make themselves appear that. All right. So once again, in closing, if US were the greater propagandist here, that's so much better at brainwashing everybody, they would have jumped on this opportunity. And I think it's a failure in the sense of US propaganda, right? To just by and large ignore this instead of using this opportunity to say, look, we were telling the truth and Russia was lying. That's all I got to say. Thanks.